blue
All right,
pill.
back on track now.
Yes.
Let's talk about the actual war, which I know
Mm,
you've been paying a lot of attention to it. I've
mm,
been paying a lot of attention to it. This is fascinating stuff. So we're sort of done talking about the sort of moral and political dimension, and now we're just going to look at how is this war actually going. So
yeah.
obviously, so what are we looking at here? This is a user-created Google map that is, as far as we can tell, one of the best summaries of how the war is going at a very specific level. Um, Generally, all these maps are kind of the same. If you look at the Institute of the Study of War for the Study of War, if you look at that South Front site I like to use, they pretty much all have the same territory. A lot of this is based on OSINT or open source intelligence. So you can see these little markers here, which are like a Twitter video of something happening. And that's sort of how this stuff is compiled.
Mm,
Obviously, we're sitting here, 10,000 miles away or something, and we don't really know what's happening, so we just have to go off of the best information we have on hand. Um,
mm,
so, given that, we're looking at Bakhmut. Um, Bakhmut has been in a process of encirclement for probably like 3 months now. I mean, the battle
mm,
for Bakhmut has been going on for 6 or more months, but the encirclement
yeah.
proper really only since maybe the beginning of January. I think they were taking Soledar, which
Mm.
is up here.
Well, yeah, it's worth saying that you might say that if you look at these blue markers, most east, up there near Krasnohora, they're east of Bakhmut, and they're sort of down near Ivabrad and Oponoy in the south there. The Russians reached that around sort of end of July, August, and like Charlie was saying, the Russians had sort of started to penetrate north and south by just before Christmas time or around sort of the New Year. And where they've really made hay on the flanks has been in since the New Year, like through January into February, through February and now March. They basically got to the point where they've had fire control over the last remaining roads. And certainly since the Russians cut off that northern road that runs west of Krasnohora, and also the roads down to Klishkiva in the south, the Ukrainian defenders have been able to only traffic themselves through Chasov Yar and Ivanivske, and then I'm trying to think. Can you just zoom in where the other road
Yeah,
is? Up part of the pincer. Just
over
just
here.
gone a bit blank because that shield is right in the way. Yeah. So is it Kromovo? I think, or Kromove? I think it's called.
Yeah, that's right here.
Yeah, so they're the only two roads they've had in and out of Bakhmut. And the thing is, it's true of any pincer. I mean, you can see this is true. It's evident. It happens in Stalingrad. It happens at the Korsun Cherkasy pocket of 1944. Is that once a pincer closes, and actually very true of Falaise pocket, which was where the Germans in Normandy were surrounded by the British and the Americans, or the Germans actually held a corridor for a very long time under great duress. But the tighter that corridor is, and the stronger those pincers are, the more essentially artillery that can be piled onto a small uh, area, and that makes logistics, extraction, reinforcement, makes every conceivable movement by troops and logistics increasingly difficult to the point of being impossible. And this is essentially where the Russian forces, or certainly the Wagner group, have found themselves in via the Ukrainians. I'd say, would you say in the last month or so, Charlie, they've been just steadily consolidating along the flanks?
Yes, for the last 2 months especially, they've had very rapid progress, pulling off this double envelopment, which is what we see now. So here's the main front, and then they're enveloped on the north and south. This is called a double envelopment. And the Russians just kept moving, rapid progress this area. But now they've sort of stalled out, which is not surprising because the Ukrainian units are becoming really packed in here, and have to hold on all the more to these last few roads into Bakhmut. So what has happened in the last few days, actually, I think about a week ago. Okay, so before we get in that, okay, so Bakhmut, people are like, Bakhmut is a bloodbath. It's a meat grinder. The Russians are just throwing their troops in and wasting their troops. The Ukrainians are. It's just a pointless battle. Okay, it's not a pointless battle. Bakhmut is the key to these four cities.
Uh-oh.
Ilya,
Robot voice again, Charlie.
um, So this last string of cities we have here, Konstantinova, Druskivka, sorry, I can't pronounce these, Kramatorsk, and Slavoyansk. Route is important because if this nut is cracked, then Russia can potentially assault these other cities, not to mention Seversk. So Bakhmut is absolutely of high strategic importance. Ukraine is doing the right thing, probably, by holding on to it as long as they can. Obviously, they're suffering a lot of casualties for that, but I wouldn't condemn their tactic in holding this as long as they possibly can, because as we know, the longer the war lasts, apparently, the more high tech assistance they're going to get from the West. So it totally makes sense from their perspective to hold this. To the extent that we can trust these markers, they have placed a lot of. Here we have the Georgian Legion. They've placed a lot of territorial or militia type units that were incorporated into the military in Bakhmut. So Ukraine has withdrawn a lot of their precious regular military and is relying on the less regular forces to hold out this siege, basically. So also a good move on their part. Obviously, you don't want your best troops to be encircled. Um, you know, as macabre as it is, you basically want your second echelon forces in here to get captured and die. That's just how it is. And also, as you mentioned, it's actually Wagner Group that is doing a lot of the fighting here, and not the Russian Ukraine, not the Russian military proper, as far as we can tell. The Russian military is involved, but this is very much a Wagner operation, which is interesting in of itself.
Indeed, and
These little
according also because there's also been reports too of Evgeny Prigozhin, who's the head of Wagner, um, essentially complaining that his forces haven't had sufficient or have not been receiving priority for artillery shells and munitions for their indirect fire support, which goes to demonstrate that Wagner themselves are not just combat units or the people been using words like assault detachments and this sort of stuff, but that Wagner themselves actually obviously have their own artillery pieces and their own like indirect support units, their own sort of mixed support, of various weapon types and what have you, and thus must actually have their own artillery weapons as well. So that was an interesting thing that I wasn't aware of up until like a week or two ago.
Mhm. So a week or two ago, actually, the Russian side, and this is confirmed. The Ukrainians retreated finally from the eastern part of Bakhmut, and that is a major step in Russia actually taking control of
Because
this city.
because the city of Bakhmut is basically split by its
Yes.
eponymous river, which is the Bamutska River, and so
Yes.
the Ukrainians have abandoned the eastern bank of it essentially.
Right, and if it this looks small on the map, but especially this area here is a lot of space to cross for the
Yes.
Russians. This
Yeah.
is a very solid defensive position the Ukrainians now have. I'm assuming they've blown these bridges. Obviously, we don't know that, but I mean, of course they've done that. They probably blew up this road as well. Um,
Yeah.
and we also know, if you look at these little dots on the map, a lot of these are like Twitter posts. Oops. Yeah, actually, that was it. Flooding of the Bakhmut Dam. A lot of these are Twitter posts, OS and open source intelligence that are showing things happen. Oops, he got suspended. But I did watch that, and yeah, the Ukrainians broke a dam and flooded out this area. Um, and
which is
obviously,
a
it's mud season.
which is a time tested defensive method. I mean, there's several instances even in World War II of particularly at the end of the war, like 43, 44 onwards, where the Germans are largely on retreat, where German engineers would blow up dam banks and dam walls and flood an area because it does releasing a amount of water on any surface, at least for a time, makes that surface almost impossible to traverse, even with tracked vehicles. So it's not unique. I mean, the Ukrainians are doing what is defensively sensible, but blowing dams and releasing water along an axis of advance for the opposition is a sensible thing to do.
Absolutely, and the most important part is the restrictions it places on the use of vehicles, because obviously you need your armored personnel carriers and hopefully tanks as well going in here supporting your infantry. as bombed out as Bakhmut is right now, there are still standing structures in there. You look at the cities after World War II, how bombed out they were, and it's actually very difficult to just completely annihilate and level a city.
And yeah, sorry, we've lost your voice again, Charlie.
Cross into there unsupported, they're going to get
Yeah.
annihilated.
Mm.
So the
It-
Ukrainians
yeah,
have a very strong position across the northern part of the front and also the eastern part.
exactly. Yeah.
On the southern front, however, the Russians or Wagner Group have been penetrating into these suburbs. And I think this is going to be the key to the fall of Bakhmut for the Ukrainians, because the Russians are now they're across the other side of the river. True, they can't really assault from the west. They can certainly fire mortars into the city from the west, but the Russians are penetrating all these neighborhoods now. Obviously, some of this is gray area. It's not like you have Wagner guys like just standing on this block, right? This is just the most we know about the current positions. This is a MiG-17 monument that was actually destroyed recently, and so this road is basically under fire control. This is what we would call maybe like a gray area. Like this is kind of no man's land, right? But that's important because if your road is in no man's land, that's an issue in terms of actually getting supplies in. They are able to use this road, however. So the Ukrainians still have a working supply route. This was a bridge that crosses a very small river, and it was destroyed. But as of I think 3 days ago, they constructed a makeshift bridge. And this link is a little this is a video. So this road is still being used. Russia's coming in from the north, but as you can see, they've kind of stalled out. If you look at a terrain analysis here, which Jimmy Thomas helped me with, he's got a very good channel. This position here in Balnadivka overlooks all these fields. This is although we see the red here highlighting this area. I doubt the Russians actually have strong positions in these fields. Maybe they've chased the Ukrainian units out. Maybe they've dug a few trenches. But I'm going to imagine their units are probably stationed more back here in these neighborhoods they've captured, because this is the perfect place to go die, basically. That's where you go if you want to be shelled by artillery and die.
Because it's what they call dead area or dead zone, because it's on a lower level than the higher vantage points. They're basically kill zones for, whether it's machine guns, mortars, artillery. You're basically the kill zone as an advancing force. So you want to, when you traverse it, you traverse it quickly and decisively. You don't just dig defensive lines and sit there and be bombarded in that territory, because Bodanivka is essentially, from what I can see, what I can perceive, is basically like a mini Popasnaya, that it's got such a vantage point over such a large area that it's actually to some degree a bit of a defensive, like a mini defensive strong point for the Ukrainians, and they're quite determined to hold it, because once they do lose Bohadivna, it actually makes Kromove vulnerable, and it opens the way for the Russians to get to Chasiv Yar from the northeast.
Right, and obviously the Ukrainians are setting up a new defensive line at Chasiv Yar. And they're not going to be able to take Kromov until they take Bodanivka, unless they're willing to take absolutely massive casualties. I'm imagining the reason we've seen the Russians stall out here is they're probably waiting for mechanized support to assault Bodkanivka, because I don't see how they are going to take Kromova without taking Bodkanivka.
Yeah, one has to happen before the other.
Exactly.
You'd imagine. And just quickly, Charlie, because you mentioned the shields that because they represent units that they've redeployed. Because what we did see a week ago is there's a whole bunch of units that were arrayed to the south to protect Chasiv Yar and Ivanivska from the south. But because we know this because the Ukrainians have been saying this, the territorial defense battalions that are deployed in Bakhmut, is that the Ukrainian army has removed basically all the artillery support from the proximity immediately around the city, and have moved this artillery into Chasiv Yar, and have basically put the artillery behind that defensive line. So not only are they establishing a defensive line of fresh battalions where you can actually see there along Kalinina, which is between Bodovina and Chasiv Yar. There's establishing a line there of soldiers, but the artillery is actually going behind that, so they're actually protecting the artillery from not being caught out by Russian advances.
Yeah, it's
Which is
obviously
sensible because artillery needs to be behind infantry.
right, well behind it. I mean, the artillery can fire dozens of miles. Obviously, it's not just sitting right up here, right? Although I'm sure some light artillery is field artillery, because then your shell will arrive in seconds as opposed to minutes. But yeah, there's far, it's not like we can see it on the map, but there's far more back here than the map is going to tell us. But yeah, so anyway, I suspect we're going to see the Russians just sort of stall here for a little while, as I assume they're going to be building up armor to a.
Yeah, it's probably worth saying as well. I'm just going to pull up the Western sources map just for a second, Charlie. Because one thing the Russians have done in the last week or so is, if you see,
the Ukrainians have had a very solid line deployed across this road for months now. The Russians cannot seem to take Ivaniska. There was a bridge over here that was destroyed. I am imagining but I would be surprised if this road was seeing significant use at this point. That said, the Ukrainians are obviously still going to hold it. It will be interesting to see whether or not they actually choose to evacuate at some point, or just allow these thousands of troops to be properly encircled. Estimates seem to range from something like 2,000 to 12,000 troops left in the city. I'm going to imagine it's probably on the lower end. I don't think the Ukrainian military is stupid. Based on what they're doing, they seem to be, they're doing everything in a perfectly sensible manner. They're establishing a new defensive line. They're holding their really important roads. They're pulling out their regular units that are very high quality.
The more elite formations have been removed already.
Yeah, so I would be surprised if Ukraine just sort of allows all of these units to be captured. That said, maybe they will. I don't know. It's interesting. That's kind of why I wanted to look at this, because I find this fascinating.
Just quickly, just because we're on the subject, because I've been just looking at the Western sources map, because it's always worth taking a standpoint from the cynical side of things. Yeah, and I mean, you're not exactly wrong. The Russians have stalled out in certain places, particularly, they arrived at Ivanivske and the outskirts of Chasiv Yar probably quicker than even I anticipated, but they have stalled outside of them, right? What they did do is actually force the Ukrainians to redeploy significant troops to the south. You can see all those shields all the way from the MiG-17 monument, all the way even south of Chasiv Yar. There's a strong number of units being deployed against that southern bulwark. But one thing I wanted to mention, because we use the phrase stalling out, is what the Russians have done is they have consolidated their flanks, because one of the big risks that happens to an encirclement is if it gets counter-encircled or if the flanks are attacked.
Exactly.
And if you just go north, Charlie, just zoom in on the northern pincer just for a second. Around Berkavivka, around here. Yeah, so they've been actually spreading. After they captured Yahidne and Prihorodne, which was earlier, and Krasnohora, they've actually been pushing in a wide front to widen the entire pincer, and that's why they've been attacking places such as I'm trying to pronounce it, Zalizniaske, and have been attacking Orikovo, Vazanivka, and then according to some others, because they said, actually someone in the chat said that there are VDV forces here. They're digging defenses because it is an obvious and a logical strategy to attack the pincer. Yes. Yeah, so the Russians are actually incrementally expanding both of their pincers and doing it in a very, very incremental way, which is the smart thing to do. And likewise, the Ukrainians are deploying forces against each pincer, because that is also smart. So both sides are basically playing the military game as sensibly as you'd expect.
Right. I mean, I've seen people talk about human wave tactics and things like this. I mean, the Russians are not the Red Army. They are executing a perfectly sensible strategy, as far as I can tell, and doing so very conservatively.
We've seen,
the fact is,
we've seen in the summer, Charlie. Yeah, I just want to say what we've seen.
You go
Sorry,
ahead.
you go. Oh, okay.
Okay,
I
I'll
was going to
go.
say,
But okay, I'll go.
okay,
You
you go.
haven't seen any
Uh,
the Ukrainians haven't counterattacked any of these successfully at all. On neither side of the envelopment have the Ukrainians affected any significant advances into these pincers wrapping around Bakhmut, which is how you know that they're doing it right, basically. And at this point, I would
yeah,
be very surprised if we see any major advances by the Ukrainians onto these positions, because the Russians are going to be digging in here, for a prolonged siege, which I kind of expect we'll
indeed.
see. So,
Yeah. I was just going to say the one of the biggest how can I put this? One of the easiest way to see through the trope of the human wave tactics is that the Russians, with the exception of that initial push, which was very much we've spoken about this even on AA's channel, Charlie, that initial couple of weeks or even the couple of months of the war where they were just literally beelining down highways and just trying to capture as much as they could as quickly as they could. And they did almost fight in a bit of a blitzkrieg style, a German mobile Bewegungskrieg type of war. After that had been brought to an end, and then the Russians went to this more incremental, methodical fire support type way of fighting, which have economized or has sought to economize losses and has sought to use firepower as the primary way of advancing in order to minimize casualties and to maximize Ukrainian casualties. The Russians demonstrated in their two pullouts, or their three pullouts actually. The one near Kiev, the Star the Boy, during the midst of the Istanbul
yeah.
talks, and then when the Ukrainians counterattacked in Kharkiv Oblast in the autumn, and then when the Russians were still holding on to Kherson, but after they were being attacked along the Kherson axis constantly, and the Ukrainians were using their HIMARS and MLRS systems to hit the Antonovsky Bridge, which crossed the river, the Dnieper into Kharkov, into Kherson. The Russians obviously pulled out from that bridgehead as well, which I didn't think they would do, but they did do. What we've actually seen is the Russians are very mindful about suffering comprehensive setbacks in terms of losses of manpower. They are actually
Yes.
willing to exchange territory and strategic opportunity to save their combat losses. So the fact that they're doing that really speaks against the trope of these human wave tactics that the Western media are clinging to. The two things I find are contradictory.
Yes, they are. So back to Bakhmut, and then we'll move on to other parts. And actually, I'm going to split this part of the stream off into a separate video since we sort of had a dead air part there. And I think these are very much two separate things. But while I've got you here, we're going to do map autism. So another thing that's happening.
Yeah, I have to reference. Who was it? I think was it not John Boy. Who was it? Someone said something along the lines of 60% negative modify for crossing rivers. It's like Hearts of Iron references.
So another thing that's happening here is, this northern part of the pincer is actually halfway to Seversk at this point, which the Russians were attempting to take some time ago so that they can siege Slavyansk over here. Where am I? I'm getting lost. It's down here.
Actually, oh, okay, yeah. I was just going to say you just panned over a part of the map, which is actually interesting. Of all the withdrawals that Russia's done, none of them have been particularly, shall I say, strategically, operationally important. But where I think Russia did get caught out, maybe by the strength of the advance by the Ukrainians, was that if they could do all this again, they would have kept hold of Liman, of Krasny Liman, and holding the Oskol River line.
Oh yeah,
Because
absolutely.
if you see where Liman is, they would have had the well, Izium is a threat more in a strategic sense to that Slavyansk Kramatorsk area. But Liman was such a linchpin, because it's the intersection of three railroads,
Right.
it's the intersection of highways, yeah.
And this
And
one's going to
also,
Seversk, right? They can't.
yeah. So that would have been the northern clamp essentially against Seversk. But the fact that the Russians did actually lose Liman, if the Russians did suffer a setback in the last 6 months, that's genuine. It was the loss of this triangle of, I think it's Liman, Yampil, and Zaridne. There's like this triangle just north of the forest line, and The Russians losing control of that was a genuine setback for them from a strategic and operational standpoint.
Absolutely, and I mean Izium too, because Izium is going to be essential in the siege of Slavyansk, because the terrain here is not advantageous to an attacker. But so yeah, that's a major setback, and of course,
Liman and Izium would have given them that two-prong attack for Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. If they also advanced south from Bakhmut, they would have surrounded it from three sides, and they've lost two of those axes already.
Yes, and the Russians have been attacking here, actually. We don't see a lot of coverage here, but they're clearly trying to reestablish control over Liman so that they can go for Seversk, obviously, because Seversk is much smaller than Bakhmut, but obviously it stands in the way. This is a valley right here, basically, that runs from Seversk to Bakhmut. Not a huge one. The terrain here is only a few hundred feet in difference, but Seversk also stands in the way of getting to Slavyansk. And if we go in the southern part of the Pincer, I mean, part of the reasons the Ukrainians have fortified this so much is because they're halfway to Konstantinivka, which is one of these string of 4 cities, the main ones being Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. The Ukrainians don't want the Russians to start assaulting Konstantinovka before they can actually even fortify it. So they're having to devote a lot of units here just to hold the southern part of their pincer.
Which is, this is where I suppose the fulcrum or the significance of Bakhmut really does matter. Pardon me, does matter for Ukraine, because this sort of fortified line, and they've kind of in a very wanky way called it the Zelensky line, but this line of defenses that stretches from Seversk, and once upon a time through Krasnohora and Soledar down to Bakhmut, down to if you go, and there's also this group of cities down. Sorry, just go south a little bit, Charlie. So you see what they call New York, and down here Zalizne, and then down to Avdiivka. This was like this line of fortifications that Ukraine had been building since 2014 or 15, and so for them, this is where the bulk of their hard position, strong points, fortifications, pillboxes, trenches. They have so many defenses here that have made life difficult for the Russian and the militias. Like for example, there's a little town here called Pisky or Pesky, which is on the outskirts of Donetsk. It took the Russians months to capture that. They did eventually capture that, and they've been actually saying that they've been expanding their bridgehead out of Donetsk city. Actually,
they have. I've been paying attention to this part of the front, and now that we're here, we can talk about it. I mean, the Ukrainian positions were just right in front of Donetsk.
Yeah, just to finish my point quickly, Charlie, is that once this defense line is breached, there is not much in the way of pre-prepared fortifications along the next line, which is Konstantinivka, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk. And Avdiivka is like one of the southern portions of this defensive line. So if you want to zoom in, I suppose we can talk about Avdiivka now. I just want to make that point about that defensive line, broadly speaking.
The 8-year-old defense line is basically here. Not over here. Because the Russians did not control Mariupol. But this part of the defenses have been built out for like 8 years. So these are going to be the strongest position that the Ukrainians have in this part of the front. And Russia has been very slowly making moves here. Pesky was under the control of the Ukrainians many months ago. And like you said, they're now making a move to Pincer Avdiivka. They've been making small advances here in the north. And the terrain favors the defender up here if you look at the topography. But I'm assuming that a lot of their resources are being devoted to Bakhmut right now. But they are making progress here. And shouldn't ignore these, because although it's not as flashy as Bakhmut, these are going to be major victories for the Russians if they can actually cut off Avdiivka and get these units to either pull out or become enveloped, encircled rather. And where is right here. So we have
this is Marinka.
Yes, this is important too. This is another small, I hesitate to call it a city. It's sort of part of the Donetsk like metropolitan area, but basically it's like the outermost suburb of Donetsk, if you want to look at it that way.
These are essentially satellite suburbs of Donetsk city, essentially.
Yes. So the Russians were back here only a few weeks ago, and they've now basically taken over 3/4 of the city. And this is significant because at this point, the part of Mariinka they've advanced to, they've gotten to this highway right here, which is part of the supply line to Ugladar, which you may have heard of. Um, Ugladar is also a very old defensive position that the Russians have not been able to take. But if they are able to cut off supplies from the north here and from the west, then they might actually be able to take Ugladar and overrun that defensive position. So these are other parts of the front where we've seen significant action. And of course, we've also seen action over Zaporizhia, but nothing much is happening here. I know a lot of people expect the Ukrainians to launch a counteroffensive here if one occurs. So I suspect that the Russians have been attacking over here just as a means of probing of the Ukrainians. And
The Russians did succeed. The Russians did succeed in shortening that line. If you just zoom in, Charlie, just at the the basin where the Dnieper River turns into the lake, on the just the left, yeah, sort of here, yeah. Hang on, whoa, yeah. If you zoom in on that city on the easternmost part of the Dnieper Lake, where the Golden Shield, zoom in there exactly, yeah. So the Russians actually pushed up from a lesser part of the line here near Virginia, Luhove, and actually pushed up to they basically control Kamyansky now and are on the outskirts of Stepova. There's like this line that runs along this highway that Ukraine just control parts of it, but the Russians have actually sought to shorten their line as well. And I dare say, with a part of the rationale in my mind for having evacuated that Kherson, the Kherson bridgehead would have been that a large portion of those troops would have been redeployed to that Zaporozhye front, which, let's face it, if Ukraine was going to counterattack there, it would have been a disaster had it actually broken through. So I'm of the opinion that some of those troops have been redeployed to Zaporozhye, and that Zaporozhye is a strong grouping for the Russians.
Yeah, Kherson was a disaster in waiting. It was inevitable that the Russians were going to get massively counterattacked there and
the inability
against the river.
The inability to capture Mykolaiv basically condemned that bridgehead. If they had captured Mykolaiv, I think it would have been a different story. But the artillery just got too close to the bridges, and that was compromising their position.
Yeah, because the Russians were in Mykolaiv at the beginning of the war, if you remember. That was one of their furthest advances, but then they quickly pulled out. So we've covered the Zaporizhia front. We've looked around Donetsk. These are really important battles. Pay attention to these, especially Mariinka, because once this city is actually taken, those Ukrainians are going to have to come up with some other defensive position. I'm sure this part of the front is fortified as well. So the Russians still have a lot of fighting to do here to actually even get to Ugladar. But as we said, if they can actually break this defensive line, that's going to be a major achievement for the Russians. And they are steadily progressing on it.
And this is the thing too. This is why the Russians have fought in the manner they have since that. You might say since May, June, July of last year into this year, is moving into that more firepower oriented doctrine, because basically the Ukrainians can barely match 20% of what Russia's firing on any given day. And the Russians are basically fighting in a methodical way where they sort of attack positions under the cover of artillery. They are destroying or setting about to destroy the Ukrainian defenses sort of piecemeal, or in the instance they dug into trenches to sort of reduce these defenses, which also then demoralizes the defenders as well. Because, I mean, let's face it, shell shock is a thing. And then to take these places, the Russians, and you'll see them like, if you look at the Western sources map, we'll go, Ukraine has repelled Russian attacks here, and here. But what it essentially is that they're probing the line constantly, and wherever then Ukraine is weak, and because especially if the two sides are of disproportionate size, is that the lesser side can't defend everywhere at once. And so this is where we've seen like the breakout and the expansion of these two pincers around Bakhmut, is where there has been the least resistance is where Wagner has pushed the most aggressively. And it makes sense to do that. It's sound military logic. And likewise, when the opponent is deeply entrenched, you have to probe with small infantry units to determine where the enemy is strong, which requires saturation by artillery, and then where they are weak, which you then seek to exploit with larger formations of infantry and mechanized units and this sort of thing. And again, this is where most normies and the media, who are an extension of the regime, misrepresent this. The fighting occurs in a particular way. And what's interesting is, we are both aficionados to some degree of the world wars, and that because we've never been really been confronted with, shall I say, a large scale conventional conflict, we've been unsure of how the next war would be fought. We kind of thought that there would be this a logical extension of Guderian's Achtung Panzer, like this streaming of mechanized units and
arguably the Russians tried that.
And arguably the Russians tried that at the beginning,
and it
right?
didn't work.
But well, it worked for. Well, you might say it was effective insofar of what they wanted to do, but it was not a way in which they were going to win the war, right? It was going to
it was a secondary element to the greater war aims.
And so what we've actually seen is, with the way that Ukraine has dug itself into defensive positions, we've basically seen like a steampunk World War One. Like it's basically World War One with T-90s and T-72s and automatic weapons.
And drones are
and
a major part here,
which has made this stuff so incremental, because what we've seen now also is how is a conventional war fought with high resolution UAVs and satellite detection and global imaging. We've never really thought about this. It's always been, oh well, the terrorists are in this cave in Afghanistan, or they're in Mosul, or they're in Fallujah, and we just send in the airborne and the Delta Force and yeet the terrorists. We're actually watching conventional war happen here, and with this technology, it's being fought in a way that I think most of us wouldn't have presumed. But here we are. So it's a learning curve for all of us, actually. To be fair.
Oh yeah, I mean, Bakhmut in particular, as I said when we started looking at the map, is particularly interesting because, there was the war in Yugoslavia, and there was Mariupol, but Bakhmut is really the first, more or less peer-to-peer, fully mobilized encirclement of a city happening in the 21st century, with the full combined arms deployed. You've got drones, you've got air power, other air power, you've got artillery. They're all in here, and this is the first time this is happening. So it's absolutely fascinating, even if we can only look at it in a very removed way.
Yeah, actually, worth highlighting, Charlie, if you can, glow in the dark from 1138. Okay. You need an offensive air force to use mechanized big arrow attacks. I actually agree with that statement. I think that's true. And obviously Ukraine, because it had these legacy systems from the breakup of the Soviet Union, and of course the West at the when they started pouring in assistance to Ukraine, it was small arms, it was munitions, and one of the first things that the West were willing to give them were anti-air systems. So Russia's air force was used a little, in the first weeks of the war was used, but has been basically grounded. Or what they've been doing is they've been firing like indirect air ground missiles, but they've been shooting them from well within their own territory and then rebasing, whether it's been at Saratov, whether it's been from air bases just outside of Moscow, right, or wherever. Or what's that other one? The big air base that got attacked by the drone. Belgorod, but the one that they attacked, the Engels airfield, which is right on the Don Volga. They've been basically shooting these missiles from well within Russian territory and then landing under the cover of their own anti-air batteries and away from interception from Ukrainian systems. But now that the Russians, through their cruise missile offensive, which they tend to, like, every 2 weeks they'll do like a big one or two big ones, and then they'll hold back and then they'll do another wave, is that they've attacked basically the electricity grid of the country, and they've also been to some degree lessening the anti-air capabilities, because they've been actually hitting these S-300 systems and these other anti-air defenses the Ukrainians have. And so, according to reports, which neither Charlie and I can particularly verify, but it has seemed, if we just go back to Avdiivka briefly, the way in which the Russians are conducting this, let's call it a secondary attack, because it is, the Ukrainians can't have a lot of troops in Bakhmut, nor can they have a lot of troops in Avdiivka, whilst also fighting these Russian pushes up in the north, which we probably should touch on before we leave the map. Mm-hmm. But apparently these pushes around the flanks of Avdiivka have been supported by army aviation. So I think we're seeing now that Russians increasingly are prepared to utilize their aviation to support ground offensives, which we're seeing now, which is I think why they've been able to break out of Pesky. I think it's why they've been able to cross that highway, that north-south highway that travels from Avdiivka up to Konstantinivka. Because
Yeah,
there
this
you
is
can see that
recent right here.
that's very recent, and I think that's actually allowed them to do that, even though they're fighting at a topographical disadvantage, like a geographical disadvantage, because Krasnohorivka and Stepove and these places are on slightly higher ground. But this is why I think the Russians are actually gaining some territory here. And someone I think mentioned in the chat before, if we want to maybe head up back into the north, these pushes out of Kremina towards and Svatove towards because one of the another I did mention that Liman was their big loss. Another loss for them was Kupiansk, because that's their basically their best bridge across the Oskol River. And these little pushes that are occurring up here in the north are also being assisted by aviation assets, according to reports. So it's interesting now how Russia's gained the confidence to push the Oskol River with their infantry forces or their ground forces in concert with aviation support.
Yes, I think one of the main reasons this war didn't go as people expected is because they're used to seeing the United States military fight with overwhelming air superiority. But in a conflict like this, where
And
both
against no air
sides
defense, right?
exactly both sides have an abundance of air defenses, so the high tech air support basically ends up grounded or just ends up as missile platforms. So effectively, you take the air force to a large extent out of the day to day fighting, um, and with the availability of drones, this makes it this adds like this entirely new element to the war where you can like there's so many different ways to use them. You can use them as this sort of loitering munitions we've seen. You can use them to spot for artillery. You can even have larger drones that are like the U.S. deploys. I don't think the Ukrainians are deploying anything like that. I do know they have these suicide drones though, that as they call them, that are also kind of they aren't like loitering munitions in the same way as these things that like drop grenades down on people, but they just sort of dive bomb into whatever. They're it's like a cross between a missile and a plane.
It's like a suicide Stuka of sorts,
Yeah, so that's
for those who are familiar with how Stukas were used in World War II.
but the artillery is different too, because like for one, you don't have your trenches. Like your trenches aren't like lines of trenches anymore, right? They're these little holes in the ground, basically dug for like two people or so, and they're spread very far apart. And of course, the artillery. We have modern airburst shells now that cover huge spaces of area, and they're firing from very far behind the line. Then it's not like you're dropping tens of thousands of shells at once. You're dropping far fewer shells across a very wide area. But you have to you can't just like shell where the enemy line is where you know it to be, because it isn't there, right? Like in World War One. So we say it's like World War One, but it's a bit different because it's not like you have these static positions that are known to both sides. You just have these large areas, and the Russians are somewhere in here, but the Ukrainians can't just bombard this entire area with unless they use all their ammunition. So, in World War One.
I've lost you again, Charlie.
So
can you repeat, Charlie? Like... Charlie, your voice went out. So all we heard was after during World War One, and then you went blank. So
yeah, well, during World War One, you would have like both armies would just be deployed a few hundred feet from each other, or yards,
and distinct lines of trenches running parallel to each other, following like the topography of the landscape, and exactly right.
Yeah, exactly. But here they're just spread out over this much larger area, so it's like World War One in a sense, but the trench warfare is really nothing like World War One. It's sort of it's a decent metaphor, but we shouldn't overuse it, I think. But it is interesting that we do see the reemergence of that style of warfare. It's just spread out much larger area.
And also too, there's also this understanding that yes, we have these we have this mechanized component, which obviously didn't exist in World War One. Certainly, I know the Allies particularly used tanks in, from 1917 onwards with increasing degrees of numerical superiority. But in the modern day, we have infantry fighting vehicles and main battle tanks and a
Plus, they
whole
can all be
host of
easily destroyed.
exactly.
You know,
And so there's an array of these armored fighting vehicles. Like even World War II, we sort of see this variety of heavy tanks, medium tanks, assault guns. There's a whole tank destroyers, a whole bunch of different categories of armored vehicles that arise out of World War II. And even in the modern day, we have different types of armored vehicles as well. So that obviously changes the disposition of it, and also we don't have the sheer concentration of troops. Like the numbers are not the same as World War One. You look, say, on the western front of World War One. The Germans are fielding something in the order of like 140 divisions. Between the French and the British, they've got 156 divisions on the Western Front. You're talking millions and millions of men. I mean, in this case, you've got a relatively long front if you consider, from the Belarusian border down to Kherson and the Black Sea. You've got a fairly long front if you think about it, like in the overall context.
oh yeah, this is a huge front.
It's a huge front, and it's only being fought. I say only; it's still a lot of men, but it's only being fought over by possibly 250,000 men on both sides, give or take.
Yeah.
Right? We know the Russians have mobilized 300,000, but this is only being fought over a very large frontage by a couple of 100,000 men. We're saying, you look at World War II, where the Wehrmacht and the Red Army were facing off each other, right? You're talking that this same space was fought over by several army groupings on both sides that contained millions of men. So
the same thing for the mechanized,
density of the war's difference.
The same thing for the mechanized units as well. I mean, instead of tens of thousands of tanks, you have hundreds or thousands, right? So they're much better tanks, but the infantry also have much better man-portable anti-tank weapons and anti-air weapons as well, that are actually throwing the balance off quite a lot. And that is what is making it, as we say, more like World War One, because the infantry have more countermeasures against these sorts of things, and they don't have the sheer numbers of tanks as they did in World War II, where I don't remember what it was. I mean, at some point they were spending like hundreds of tanks per day, right? On the Russian side, which obviously if Russia did that now, then they would have no tanks very quickly.
And this is the thing too, I haven't heard spoken about. Sorry, just because we've arrived here, and it's actually something, because I had actually meant to read my post, but for anyone who doesn't know, I actually suffered a bit of a hand injury a couple of weeks ago, so I've not been able to type and do stuff. I've only just like last couple of days had use of my thumb again. But one thing, because I'm going to write about like historical analogies and how they apply to this war, and because I've mentioned things such as the Korsun Cherkasy pocket, I've mentioned Falais pocket. Another thing to consider too is that the West is intent on sending all this stuff, and it's like you hear people even on Sky or BBC or whatever news station, our ABC, same thing. Once Ukraine gets these tanks and this equipment, it can launch offensives. But this is the, I call it the Panzer-Lehr problem. And for anyone who's aware, the Panzer-Lehr was a division that fought in Normandy to face off the Normandy invasion in 1944. Because what the Germans it probably correctly surmised was that if we have these static divisions, these garrison divisions, and if we bulk them out with some elite Fallschirmjäger, which is the German paratroopers, right? If we can flesh them out with paratroopers, we use them as shock troops, and then we deploy our elite Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions to Normandy, we can contain the invasion, throw the Allies back into exactly. You've pulled up Normandy, perfect. We can throw the Allies back to the sea. But the problem is they had some of these elite divisions they bound together, and particularly with the Panzer-Lehr, is that they poached the German panzer schools of many of their instructors. And so, yes, they had this very capable division that was lavishly equipped, but the Panzer-Lehr was essentially whittled down to, I think, 50% casualties within a fortnight of fighting. And then the tank crews that came out of Germany were worse. And then, of course, as the old adage goes, the longer the war, the younger the soldiers. So there was younger soldiers being put through the panzer schools that didn't have the same education as the older tank crews. And as Germany started sustaining increasing degrees of losses throughout 1943, 44, and into 45, they were literally putting, at the point where they're putting like teenagers and young adults in tanks that had no combat experience. They weren't being educated by experienced veteran officers. And so the point I'm trying to make is, it's all well and good that they send these things to Ukraine. These the Challenger 2 tanks, the Abrams, the Leopards, whatever. But if they have suffered terrible losses amongst their elite formations, particularly in the first year of the war, as Ukraine has, who have they got to put in those tanks? What kind of crews can they install in those
Right.
tanks that have combat experience and be veterans? And then to obviously fight as a cohesive unit, it's one thing to have one experienced tank crew, but you've got to have several experienced tank crews to make a tank company. And they have to be able to function in cohesion with each other and in coordination with other forces, with infantry units, with territorial defense battalions, right? And I have never heard this mentioned once on any stream or on any news article, and it's a point that can't be ignored.
Right. Well, this is the problem with the Western way of war is that we just look at it and we're saying, okay, look, we're just going to send all this high technology to Ukraine, and that's just going to automatically win. How can anyone oppose it? And the answer is that it actually doesn't get you very far by itself, because you very quickly um, run out of those things when you use them in a sustained war. Like the United States is used to fighting these very quick wars, like in Iraq, where it suffers virtually no losses, and through 2 or 4 weeks of shock and awe, you just utterly annihilate the foe. But the problem is, if you are fighting a sustained war, these high tech um, devices are going to be destroyed. A lot of that is your fighter jets.
Oh,
So,
we lost you again, Charlie.
uh, well, it takes much longer to produce these high tech devices
Yeah.
and train people up to use them, and produce them in sufficient quantity such that they can actually make a difference. Like they're sending
Mm.
in combined total of something like 100 Abrams and Leopards and some other modern tanks to Ukraine, but those are going to only last a few weeks, and it's not enough tanks to really make a difference across this entire front. Even if they were concentrated, it's not enough for a major offensive. So the sort of
Mm.
trickle of high tech stuff is not how this war is going to be won. One thing that has made a difference, I'll say, it's not that this stuff doesn't make a difference. The HIMARS, in particular, these long range rockets or missiles that have been given to Ukraine have made a huge difference in the war because it enables Ukraine to actually reach basically anywhere in Ukraine. So virtually no part of the Russian territory is safe from the HIMARS missiles, which is a big deal because it prevents them from stockpiling for their own offensives. So that has definitely made a difference. It's not that the technology doesn't make a difference, but the West views these fancy toys as the implement that is going to win the war, or their economic tricks. This is something I wanted to get into in the Perun video, which we'll do another time. But the
Indeed,
West, they
indeed.
use their sanctions and
Mm.
economics and their technology as how Russia's going to lose the war, and they're thinking about everything.
Yeah. Sorry, guys, we
Or
just
not
lost
some sort
Charlie
of
again.
technology.
Mm. Yeah, audio's
Ukraine
gone
just
to hell, Charlie.
Ukraine can't sustain that because they don't have the manpower that the Russians have. The Russian
Mm.
economy has not collapsed. It's doing perfectly fine.
Mm.
Russia is not running out of everything.
I-
So what is
It's
the
worth
plan here from the West to win this? Right?
it's worth touching on that subject very briefly. Just because one thing that the West does do, and I think I might have said this in either the first or the second video where AA touched on this in UO, is that the interesting thing with the Crimea, the Maidan coup, the Crimea situation, right, is that because that was sort of towards the end of Obama's second term, and America and its European allies obviously hit Russia with sanctions. And what's interesting is that the West often given if we think about the culture that we're ensconced in the West, amongst our governments and our societies, right? We love this idea of an easy virtue signal that is a cost free, symbolic gesture, right? that has real world implications, and some of it can be very cynical. I mean, one only has to think of Madeleine Albright, and who she being who she was, and saying yes, it was worth hundreds of thousands of Afghan children, to sanction Iraq, for the Gulf War situation. These are people who are willing to do this kind of thing without even batting their eyes. But one thing that, or I don't know if it's been completely ignored. I think I've heard musings about this online, but the sanctions passed in 2014-15 in response to Maidan and Crimea against Russia was that I think it forced the Russians to orient their economy and to, you might say, inoculate it against sanctions and to strengthen it internally and to ensure that it had trade partners. Moreover, and I think this has been said. I think maybe I think Alex Mercurius might have said this, but even in World War II, against the evil Nazis, the actual Nazis, the Western nations didn't actually abscond with Germany's reserves, its foreign reserves, its currency reserves, or its bullion, which is what the West did against Russia last year in 2022.
Right. We froze or confiscated 100 billion in gold, or right.
Exactly. So this is where I think this. I don't know if anyone knows this, but now that I think Iran and the Saudis and Turkey have joined BRICS, BRICS now has a greater and I know GDP is a very flawed way of measuring economies, but for the sake of the discussion, the BRICS organization now has a greater GDP value than what G7 does. We're literally in the face now of a rival economic bloc being oriented towards the East, that rather than being built upon false economy as much of the Western economy is, it's being built on resources, on real tangible value, on output, of goods more than services, and the things that keep a country and an economy running. And I mean, in the end, they thought the sanctions would crush Russia. They haven't crushed Russia. The Russian economy has proven resilient in the face of it. And in fact, it's half of Europe that is facing profound energy shortages and will struggle to get through another winter. So this idea that the Russian economy has been forced to strengthen itself and to be calloused against Western measures is an important point as well, whereby with the loss of the Donbass, Ukraine is faced to lose half its GDP almost. So there's always that discussion to be had.
Well, that's why this is also stupid, is because Russia could have been brought into the West after the fall of the Soviet Union, but instead our idiotic leaders decided they just needed to destroy Russia. There might be some reasons for that we can't talk about on YouTube. I'm sure you can use your imagination there. But at the end of the day, what's happened? Now we've forced Russia to look eastward, and it's cooperating with China, who certainly are no friends of ours. And Russia is going to end up controlling large parts of Ukraine. Why did we do this? Russia could have been a Western ally and partner, but instead we're forcing them east and creating these new competitors that may end up completely unseating the Western powers. And we want a strong West because we're Western, we're pro-West. We don't want powerful China, and that's really where all this is leading. It's not leading to some sort of powerful Russia that's going to oppose the West. It's leading to a powerful China. They're going to be the senior partner in this arrangement, most likely, and that is where things are going. That's what we don't want. That's why this is also stupid. I mean, on top of it, none of these people, well, some of them do, but these places do not want to be part of Ukraine.
Oh, sorry, your voice is going again, Charlie.
The United States idiotic interests that are not actually helping the West, right? Ultimately, I am pro-West, and the problem is our entire approach to this region of the world since the fall of the Soviet Union has been entirely contrary to our interests.
May I just make a quick caveat as well? Is that as we do, we love our civilization. All the more reason why we cannot accept it being run by hostile and rogue elites who are bent on who are bent on corroding and destroying our civilization from within. That should be our preeminent concern. And just very quickly, I just wanted to mention, because I did see a comment here, that who was it? Sorry, let me just find this comment. Yeah, Jacob said, I would argue China's GDP is even more BS than US's. I actually mostly agree with that point. I think there's a lot that can be said for like Chinese speculation and a lot of the shall I say, economic window dressing that the Communist Party does to embellish its strength and to make it look larger than what it is. But it cannot be refuted that much of the West has relocated its industry to China for the sake of economies of scale and for this whole Western liberal myth of purchasing power and making goods cheaper for people. They've just basically exported their economic output, their industrial output to China, and that can't be ignored. And the fact of the matter is that the reason why this, if we lived in a world of wholesome elites who actually cared about the prospects of their civilization and their people, right, it would make sense that, see, China and Russia have opposing problems. China has arguably too many people and too large a population and insufficient resources. Russia, even though it itself is a relatively populous nation, has a lot of space, probably not enough people for that space, but is blessed with resources, and only because of the fall of the Soviet Union and under Putin's leadership from 99, 2000 onwards, because that decade under Yeltsin was just very much a lost decade for Russia and the Russian people, is that there's been a reorganization and a reorientation of the Russian economy. And I've spoken about this when I've spoken about agriculture with Mr. Patriarch, with Radical Liberation, and AA himself. I've made a point to reference that the Soviet Union used to be a grain importer. The Soviet Union used to struggle to feed itself. Russia in the modern day, and has been for about 10 years or even especially 5 years prior to the war breaking out, was the world's largest exporter of wheat. Russia has not only been able to satisfy its own demand, it has become an export giant in its own right. The economy that Russia has now is a much more sophisticated and efficient economy than what the Soviets had. And I don't want this as a big line go up discussion. I don't mean it in that sense. But, an economy should exist to serve its people and its country. And I think the Russian one largely does. Russia, in some respect, is achieving what the mid-century Germans and Italians could not, and that's a sense of autarky. Someone else mentioned in the chat, so I should credit them, and that's why I've had this thought process. But Russia's got this economic autarky thing down pat. But going back to what I was saying just previously about if we had wholesome elites who cared about a civilization, they would see that having Russia on board against a Bolshevik communist China would make sense, because China wants what Russia has. It's the space and the resources. But instead, our elites have pushed these two parties together who can have a reciprocal relationship where China has the factories and the population, Russia has the resources and the space, and they can trade with each other. We in the West, or not we as in you and I, because we don't make this stuff happen, neither do our viewers, but our elites have made this happen. They have pressed what could have been two opposition powers into each other's arms. That has been a result, a consequence of our own policy, of our own elites who have done this, and that can't be forgotten.
Yeah, very well said. Okay, so I guess we've been going for 2 hours now, so let's wrap up. As I said earlier, I'm going to split. I think what I'll do is I'll actually just download the stream, split it up into 2 videos, and then delete the stream. So if you see it disappear, don't worry about that. I just want to keep the first portion separate from the second portion.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, and that gives you a chance to upload that video too, and we can analyze it properly. Because I think going through an hour of parent
no, I don't want to do that. I had to watch that video like 5 times. I had to watch that video like 5 times to edit it. It was awful. But
and just quickly too, just because you did bring out the comment, it was great to see Theti comment, because I have to say, watching his videos have been, because I've sort of been oscillating a little bit. I know Military Summary Channel, I know Dima can go off in his own tangents, but it's like Theti and Dima have been quite useful sources, like just to pitch the map, like to pitch the war in a map and geographical context and where units are and whatever. And of course, Dima, I mean, he sounds Eastern European. I don't know whether he's Russian or Ukrainian, but it's good to get his perspective. And obviously, Mr. Theti, being one of our guys, he brings a view into Twitter, and that map that he has is excellent. So thank you, sir. Well, to both of them, but they both do good work, and especially Teddy, good that he could drop in, and his work is great. So I just want to plug him.
Yeah, definitely. I didn't even know he was one of our guys, as you said. I just really enjoy his map.
I want
So
to say our guys, like someone who's willing to speak about the war honestly,
sure.
is more what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't even know that. I've only watched a couple videos on that channel. I mostly just love the map. Thankfully, I mean, without map autists like Teddy mapping, we would have nothing to talk about basically. So
So
I
indeed, thank you for
definitely
coming.
I
So
echo your statements there.
yeah,
So right, okay, well, like I said, I'm going to download this, split it into the two sections, and we'll definitely do a part 2 or 3. I kind of want
oh
to
for
do an
sure.
ongoing since no one else seems to want to talk about the war, I want
Mm,
to have you on as the war progresses and talk more just
mm,
about what's happening. But we're definitely going to do a part 2 on the
mm.
Rune video, which is what we wanted
Yeah,
to do tonight
and
anyway.
that will also
So,
give me a chance to rewatch it because I remember just watching it and
and
just
look, I'll
and like
share the upload with you. I'm going to upload
and
the
of course, yeah, yeah,
13-minute one, and you can just
yeah.
watch that.
Yeah, of course. I do want to watch the full one again. Because you know how sometimes it is when you're watching something, you just your bookmarks like, oh, that point I want to address, that point I want to address, that point I want to address. And even if it's not in your 12-minute upload, there's still little parts of it that are worth like counterpointing or reacting to. So yeah, no, but we'll focus around your 12-minute edit and we'll play it by ear. But I think at least the part 2 is a good idea. And indeed, because I'd like to think that we A share a similar perspective on this, and B, this topic is contentious in our circles and people are very polarized about it. So indeed, if you fancy maybe once a month or however often you want to talk about it, I would be delighted to join you for that.
Good. Yeah, I mean, I understand why people don't want to engage with this topic, but the fact is, I mean, even if you don't really care about the war, I mean, there's really no way the war does not affect you. This is the if you live in the West, this you should be concerned with this war because the war is affecting
Mm,
you. I don't think it's something we can just ignore or not have opinions on or not actively try to put an end to because obviously, as I said at the beginning, war is the primary means through which the Anglo-American Empire expands its power. Our friend
and
Stephen
feeds
Carson
itself,
knows this.
you
The
know.
libertarians understand this very well.
Mm,
If anything,
mm,
so we absolutely should be concerned about it. And
mm,
again, I just think it's important for us to comprehend the actual moral weight of what is happening here because our governments are responsible for mass murder, and they are using this war
mm,
to expand their global
mm,
homo agenda at the
mm.
this narrative has replaced
Charlie, you cut out after Global
bloody
Homer
hell.
agenda.
The
Sorry.
fact that this narrative has replaced the coronavirus narrative as the
Mm,
number one thing that the regime is concerned
mm,
with should basically tell you everything about how
mm.
significant this is. So
It should speak
anyway,
volumes within itself, right? So if I may just buttress you one last time, Charlie, I'll have to say that, and this can't be underestimated, is that the outcome of this war, right, will affect us and our
absolutely.
nations one way or another, and that is irrefutable. And the for those of us who actually genuine, and I'm not accusing guys who disagree with us of not caring about their countries or civilizations. I don't want to be misunderstood. But for those of us who do care about our civilizations and our societies, right, need to be cognizant of the fact that anything that discredits hostile elites and fake narratives and regime propaganda is of vital importance. And we have to address, or we have to keep that in mind however way this war unfolds in the weeks and months yet to come, because like you say, they are willing to fuel this furnace, this and to encourage the thrusting of men into this meat grinder. And when we see flags, whether they're Ukrainian flags or Russian flags on body bags, those of us who love European civilization should be saddened by that sight. And the fact that there are, if I may quote Gonzalo Lira, if there are system pigs profiting from this and standing on the bleachers applauding this carnage, is disgusting, and they're using it to profit themselves, and they are absolutely like they don't care a fig for what is sacrificed for it, what they push into it, whether it's men or material or weapons. No matter how much they suck dry the American or the British or the Australian or the French or the Italian taxpayer, whoever's contributing to this war, right? They will sap our country dry to feed their megalomania and their sadism, which is what this boils down to, and to feed their own interests. And we should all be disgusted by that, and we should never forget it.
Well, that was a perfect outro. So I will go ahead and end the stream. Thanks to everybody for showing up. And yeah, please share the subsequent uploads I'll do probably tomorrow after I cut this down. So with that, bye bye.
Thanks, guys.